I've always considered myself an outdoorsman. Growing up in a small town in the Pacific Northwest, camping was as natural to me as breathing. Of course I'd go camping with friends, but there's something profoundly serene about camping in the solitude of the wilderness. So, when any opportunity arose for a solo camping trip deep in the woods, I jumped at it. During a break my senior year of high school, the plan was simple: 3 days, 2 nights, just me in the wild. I packed lightly, just the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, a couple of MREs, water, and my trusty old Swiss Army knife. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, the familiar hum of my truck's engine blending seamlessly with the anticipation thrumming through me. I arrived at the trailhead just before noon, the sun hanging high in a clear blue sky. The trail was well marked, a narrow ribbon winding through the dense forest. I set off with a light heart and an eager stride, the forest welcoming me with open arms. The first few hours passed in a blur of green and brown, the trail winding deeper and deeper into the woods. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the occasional call of a bird, and my own footsteps crunching on the forest floor. I felt at peace, the worries of the world falling away with each step. By late afternoon, I reached my chosen campsite, a small clearing by a babbling brook. The area was perfect, secluded yet open enough to provide a clear view of the sky. I set up my tent quickly, my hands moving with practiced ease. Once everything was in place, I gathered some firewood and set about making a small campfire. As dusk fell, I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. The forest around me was alive with the sounds of night, crickets chirping, frogs croaking, the occasional rustle of leaves as some nocturnal creature went about its business. I felt a sense of contentment wash over me, the kind that only comes from being truly alone in nature. The first night was fairly uneventful, but right before I went to bed, I heard this sound, like a low guttural growl somewhere in the distance. When I heard it, for a moment I felt a knot in the pit of my stomach but brushed it off and told myself I was being ridiculous and headed off to sleep. I woke with the dawn, feeling refreshed and ready for another day of exploring. The second day was much like the first, filled with hiking and quiet contemplation. I wandered through the forest, marveling at the beauty of the untouched wilderness. The hours slipped by unnoticed, the sun climbing higher and higher in the sky before beginning its slow descent. It was just as the sun dipped below the horizon that things began to change. I was sitting by the fire, poking at the embers with a stick, when I heard it again, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. At first, I thought it was just my imagination turning the wind into the same sound I heard the previous night. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. That low growl in the distance coming from the darkness beyond the firelight. There was just something different about this sound. I can't really explain it. My heart skipped a beat, my body tensing instinctively. I strained my ears, listening intently. The growl came again, closer this time. I grabbed my knife, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The growl came again, and this time, it was accompanied by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Twigs snapped, and leaves rustled as whatever it was, crawled just out of sight. I stood up slowly, every muscle in my body taut with fear. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was just a bear, curious but ultimately harmless if I didn't provoke it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. This sound, this presence, felt different. It felt malevolent. The fire crackled louder in the silence, the only source of light in the encroaching darkness. I edged closer to the flames, hoping they would deter whatever was out there. The growl came again, so close now that I could feel the vibrations in my chest. My breath came in shallow, rapid gasps, my pulse pounding in my ears. The sound of heavy footsteps thudded against the forest floor. Whatever it was, seemed to be moving in a circle around my campsite. I turned slowly, trying to keep my eyes on every angle, but the darkness was too thick, the firelight too dim to penetrate it. I held my knife out in front of me, a feeble defense against whatever was out there. The footsteps stopped, and the forest fell into an eerie silence once more. I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. My skin prickled with the sensation, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow, darker than the rest, shifting just at the edge of the firelight. I whipped around, knife raised, but there was nothing there. Just the dancing shadows and the oppressive darkness. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I felt like whatever was out there was toying with me, stalking me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I needed to stay calm, to think clearly. I couldn't let fear take over. Just then, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the clearing, followed by a chilling silence. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, my body frozen in place. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and frantic, as the seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Without warning, a branch snapped loudly behind me, and I spun around, knife at the ready. The firelight flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move and shift with a life of their own. For a brief moment, I saw a pair of glowing eyes, reflecting the firelight, staring at me from the darkness. I stepped back, my foot catching on a root and sending me stumbling to the ground. The eyes were gone, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the knife with white-knuckled intensity. The fire was dying down, the embers glowing faintly as the shadows crept closer. I had to keep it burning, had to keep the light alive. I grabbed a handful of kindling and tossed it onto the fire, the flames leaping up briefly before settling into a steady glow. I heard a branch snap to the left of me, and I saw the outline of a massive shape lurking just beyond the firelight. It looked hunched over, its form indistinct but menacing. My mind raced with terror, imagining all the horrors that could be hiding in the darkness. "Get out of here! Leave me alone!" My voice echoed through the trees, but whatever was out there didn't flinch. We stood there in kind of a standoff. Me by the fire, knife in hand. The thing that was out there, not moving in front of me but far enough to stay hidden in the dark. Minutes passed, then an hour. I had eventually sat back down by the fire, eyes glued to the darkness in front of me. I knew I couldn't go in my tent. I knew I couldn't go to sleep. My only thought was to stay awake, keep the fire going, and get the hell out of there come first light. At some point in the night, the wind began to pick up. By dawn, the forest gradually returned to its normal rhythm, as if nothing had happened. At some point in the night, I'm assuming when the wind had started blowing hard, whatever was out there had left. When it was light enough, I packed up my campsite as fast as I could. Heading back through the trail, my skin kept crawling and I had a feeling like I was being watched. I kept listening for footsteps or branches breaking, but there was nothing. I felt such relief as I drove away. The wilderness is still my sanctuary, but you'd be a fool if you don't think it has its own secrets, its own dangers. Some things are just better left in the dark. One of my favorite things is to get in my car, drive somewhere, and go hiking and camping. It's so critical, especially these days, to disconnect from the stresses of daily life and reconnect with nature. There's true solace in the simplicity of a starlit sky or the tranquility of a secluded forest clearing. I'm small, like 5 feet, although I'm physically strong, and it's true that bad things can happen to anyone. Being a solo woman camper and hiker does add an extra layer of challenges and concerns. Safety is paramount, requiring careful planning and awareness of your surroundings. While the wilderness offers liberation, it also poses risks, from navigating unfamiliar terrain to encountering wildlife. I have 2 working-line German Shepherds, Rocco and Scout, who go with me everywhere. I don't think they create a false sense of security for me, but I know for a fact that they do offer me protection that I wouldn't have otherwise if I went out and didn't have them. About 2 years ago, my dogs and I went on a weekend camp at a spot we've been to numerous times. I like to camp by this lake that's just absolutely beautiful. My dogs will swim in the water and I can relax and just recharge. In the late afternoon, I took Rocco and Scout for a quick walk before it got too dark. The trail behind our campsite wound through dense forest and led up to a lookout that reflected the twilight sky perfectly. As we walked back to the campsite, the last bit of sunlight disappeared, and the forest seemed to close in around us. I flicked on my flashlight, casting long shadows between the trees. Both Rocco and Scout suddenly stopped and growled. This wasn't too unusual, as this is something they do on our hikes sometimes. Their eyesight and hearing is way better than mine. Back at the campsite, I lit a small fire and settled in with a book. Rocco did a few laps of the perimeter before lying near Scout on the ground. A couple of times both Scout and Rocco would lift their heads and sniff the air. Twice Rocco got up and stood at the edge of our site and growled into the woods. While something similar had happened before and I wasn't too concerned, I did start to get a tightness in my stomach that I couldn't shake off. I just had a sense we were being watched. It was getting late, so I went to bed. My dogs didn't seem bothered again that night, so I figured it must have been a coyote or something that they had smelled. The next morning, we were not even 15 minutes into our trek back when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps from farther up the hill. When the trail's crowded, or we're in a heavily forested areas or where there's tricky terrain like rocks or boulders, I keep my dogs on a long leash attached to my waist. That way I can pull them in close to me if I need to. After the sound of the footsteps, both Rocco and Scout started barking. Up ahead, a man was walking down the hill, not on a trail. He was older, if I had to guess maybe in his 50s. He was dirty and wearing a backpack and was walking right toward me and my barking dogs. He kept coming closer, finally stopping about 10 feet away. He kept staring at me with this unsettling intensity. I said hello to him, but he just continued to stand there. Finally he spoke. "Saw your fire last night." "Oh?" I said. "Good dogs you got there." He nodded to Rocco and Scout, who were still barking at the man. "Yep, they're very protective of me," I said and smiled. "Okay, well, we're headed back." I kept Rocco and Scout close to me as we walked past the man. I had such a bad feeling as we walked past him. After about 30 steps I turned around and he was still standing there staring at us. For the whole walk back I just had a sense that he was behind us, but every time I looked, no one was there. When we got back to the trailhead, there were a few other cars in the parking lot. A truck had parked next to me, but no people. I was loading the gear in the trunk of my car when both Rocco and Scout started growling and barking. I looked around but didn't see anyone. I quickly opened the door to the back seat and got Scout situated. I had just secured Rocco in the other seat when I heard someone running. I turned and there was a man. I jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the door just as the man crashed into my car and tried to open my door. Rocco and Scout were going crazy. The man was banging on my window and yelling. I couldn't tell what he was saying because I was so focused on getting out of there. I quickly reversed and sped out of the parking lot. I drove to the nearest gas station, which was about 10 miles away, pulled over and called the police. An officer met me at the gas station and took my statement as another officer went to the trail. They didn't find the man, of course. I have no idea what he was thinking or wanted to do, but I know it wasn't good. I'm just grateful I had my dogs with me. It was mid-October, and the air was crisp with the bite of the approaching winter. My friends and I had decided to go on one last camping trip before the winter set in. There were 4 of us, me, Dave, Laura, and Ben. We were experienced campers, well-versed in the do's and don'ts of surviving in the wilderness. We went to this forest we'd been to numerous times before, about 30 minutes outside town. Ben said he'd found a campsite that was suggested by a few people on Reddit and was about a 5-mile hike in. We arrived at our campsite in the late afternoon. The clearing was secluded, a natural haven that seemed untouched by time. I always liked to set up my tent a little further away from everyone, and I picked a spot closer to the edge of the forest. After dinner, we sat around the campfire, sharing stories and laughing. As the night grew darker, the temperature dropped and a light dusting of snow started to fall. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. One by one, we retreated to our tents, the fire dying down to embers. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the faint rustling of leaves outside. Sleep came slowly, as it always does, because my mind won't quiet until it replays the day's events. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I woke up with a start. At first, I didn't know what had disturbed my sleep, but then I heard it, a faint whispering behind my tent. The voice was low and indistinct. I was certain it was one of my friends outside my tent. Honestly, I was pretty annoyed to be woken up. "Seriously?" I called out. The whispering stopped abruptly. I waited, but there was no response. Slowly, I unzipped my tent and peered outside. The forest was dark, the fire long extinguished. Moonlight filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows on the ground. I saw nothing unusual. I figured I must have had a lucid dream or something. But as I lay back down, the whispering began again, this time closer, almost as if it were right outside my tent. Annoyed, I crawled out of my tent and stood up. The snow had stopped, and I could see my breath in the moonlight. I turned on my flashlight and swept the beam around the campsite. Everything seemed normal, the tents of my friends undisturbed. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the snow, were footprints. Not the kind made by hiking boots or sneakers, but bare, human footprints. It made absolutely no sense, and the sight of them sent a chill down my spine. The prints were eerily perfect, as if someone had carefully pressed their feet into the ground. Each toe and heel was distinct, suggesting a slow, deliberate pace. I stepped out of my tent and followed the path with my flashlight. The footprints began at the edge of the forest and then moved inward. The steps stopped by the back corner of my tent. The last set of footprints appeared to be slightly deeper than the rest, as if whoever, or whatever, had lingered there. The snow hadn't accumulated as much beyond my tent because of the protection of the branches above, so it looked like whoever was standing there had vanished. It was as though the forest had swallowed the trespasser whole, leaving no trace of where they had gone or how they had arrived. The implications were terrifying. These weren't the tracks of an animal. Someone had come to our camp, walked silently among us, and disappeared. The realization struck me hard. We were not alone. Someone was out there, and had come unnervingly close to my tent.
Dave, Ben, Laura.
I called out, my voice louder now.
Wake up.
One by one, they emerged from their tents, groggy and confused. I showed them the footprints. It took a minute for the realization to set in. I had to convince Ben it wasn't a joke. I put my foot next to the footprint. Mine was a few inches larger than what was in the snow. It felt safer for all of us to stay close, so we decided to bundle together in Dave's tent because his was the largest. We waited up for about an hour to see if whoever was out there came back, but there were no more whispers. I couldn't stop my mind from thinking about what just happened and only ended up getting a few minutes of sleep at a time for the rest of the night. It ended up snowing again that night. By the time dawn came and we left Dave's tent, the footprints were gone. After breakfast, I asked Ben where on Reddit he found this site. He said the site was mentioned in a subreddit on haunted campsites. He told us he thought it was a joke and we'd all have a big laugh about it. Laura got pissed and wanted to leave, so we packed up early and headed back to the car. To be honest, I don't know what happened that night. Was it really a ghost? Was it Ben playing some stupid joke on us? Was there someone out there in the woods? I'll never know. The memory of that night still creeps me out. To be honest, sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I think about that faint, ghostly whisper, and I wonder if I should go back there to see if it happens again.